any discussion about the justice of God is going to require the remembering that justice and righteousness in the Bible are synonymous. Justice and righteousness are inseparable. Justice and righteousness are interchangeable, and they reflect and mirror each other. They're concepts that God has put together that we would understand more and more about who he is. I say that because we cannot escape the reality that his justice, no matter what it looks like, feels like, seems like, no matter how we read it in the Psalms, no matter how we read it in the rest of the Bible, no matter how we experience it in life or feel like we don't experience it in life, we have to understand that it's flowing from his holy righteousness, meaning they're both concepts that God that speak of God's desire to make all things right. Now, then, and forevermore. And that's where some of the confusions come in, right? Because sometimes it feels like the now part of the equation is lacking justice. Especially as we live in and amongst a society where it seems like injustice runs rampant. I would only ask and beg of you to please even consider, well, what would it look like if God removed his presence from his people? It would be horrific. So here's the idea. Often when we think about justice, we think in terms of someone being held responsible for the wrong that they've done. And that can look different as we grow up, right? That looks different when you're 5 than when you're 15 and when you're 35 or 50, right? When we talk about justice, one of the things that we think about, or often that we get stirred up about, is the reality that people have to be held responsible for their actions. That's justice. But the biblical definition for justice is so much more profound. Simply put, it's understood as God's perfect, follow this with me, his perfect, right, and impartial standard of fairness that flows from his holy character. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute. Did they coordinate and plan to sing that song where they would go, holy, holy? I would ask, does anybody else get the can't help it's when you sing songs like that? Meaning this, you just can't help it. Right? I don't know if you watch, but there are moments that are unexpected. Like I'm sitting down and we start singing of God's holiness and my body has to get up and move a little. Which is interesting because hips are usually associated with unholiness, but within the context of what we're doing, right? Listen, the justice of God is to be understood as his perfect, right, and impartial standard of fairness that flows from his holy character, his perfect character, his character that is set apart, if you will, from ours. When we think about justice, especially when it relates to some of the confusions and frustrations that we have to remember that our perspective on it is limited and imperfect. And we have to trust a perfect God to play out his righteousness, justice, the way that he sees fit, even if we don't understand it. Because his justice is perfect, right, and impartial. Perfect, right, and impartial. This is a big concept. I was walking with Ezekiel. Many of you know I was out of town last week. We were out of town. We were on the other coast. I'd never been to the Atlantic Ocean, let alone in it. It's warm down in southern Florida this time of year. Even if it's raining sideways, it's hot and muggy and warm. And if you're wet, you might as well get wet. And I was walking with Ezekiel by the Atlantic Ocean. There was a moment where he overcame his fears and decided, I'm going in! And he's just like getting barreled and pitted all at the same time. It was fantastic. He gets up, snot coming from his nose. He's like, I got pitted, Dad! And I looked at him, and the thought I had was, you are my absolute favorite. Then I had to tell him, you are my absolute favorite. And he gets this big, old, snotty smile, the snot that comes from drinking too much ocean water. He's this big old smile, like, oh, I am. And I had to look at him and go, but don't tell the other ones. You see, we're partial. And when it comes to injustice or justice, there's absolutely no way that we can have a perspective that is impartial. Now, I know, just so you're aware, I know that I have other children, all of which I've told them that they are my absolute favorite as well. And if they all maintain secrecy, we'll be fine. But see, we're partial people. This is why the justice of God is so important. Because from his omnipotence and omniscience, from his nearness, he sees in ways that we don't. Justice is to be understood in this way. In fact, the psalm that we read speaks of it. Psalm 89 verse 14 says, righteousness and justice, same word, are the foundations of your throne. Steadfast love and faithfulness go before you. In other words, what the psalmist is declaring is that righteousness and justice flow from the foundation of God's throne. Righteousness and justice, the character of righteousness and justice that God maintains in a way that's very different than anyone else, is literally flowing from his throne. Now, here's the interesting thing. If you look at the rest of the biblical narrative, you'll also understand at one point in human history, there was something else that came from the throne of God. His Son, who sat at the right hand of the Father, at the right hand of power before the throne, and he became incarnate. See, I think this, justice is best understood and seen through the ministry of the Son of God, through the ministry of Jesus. So with that in mind, if you have a Bible, I'm going to invite you to turn to the book of John, chapter 8. The book of John, chapter 8. And as you're turning there, I'm going to start reading of this story, and I want you to understand it as you're making your way through it. This biblical narrative story, this story about Jesus' interaction with some sinners, has been used throughout history to communicate all kinds of different things. It's been used throughout history to communicate forgiveness. It's been used throughout history to communicate love. It's been used throughout history to manipulate people into to stop being jerks. It's been used throughout history to manipulate people to come to the front and accept Jesus as their Lord and Savior. It's been used in a lot of ways throughout church history. For our purposes today, as we make our way through this narrative, I'm going to ask that you hear it and look at it from the perspective of how it communicates God's perfect, right, and impartial standard of fairness that flows from his holy character, seen in the presence of his Son. John chapter 8, they went each to his own house. Just know this, John places this account within the context of the Feast of Tabernacles. Jesus, right before this moment, if we're following along chronologically, John wants us to understand that right before he communicates this concept about God, Jesus had stood up on the great day of the Feast of Tabernacles and said, if anybody thirsts, let him come to me and drink. If anybody is worried or frustrated or overwhelmed, you come to me and I can make a difference in your life. And then we move in John's gospel right to this account. It says they went each to their own house, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. And early in the morning, verse 2, he came again to the temple, and all the people came to him, and he sat down and he taught them. Just know this, during that feast, Jesus was going back and forth to the temple, and he was teaching. He was proclaiming the kingdom. He was proclaiming the character of God. It says in verse 3 that the scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and placing her in the midst, they said to him. So Jesus is there teaching about the kingdom of God, about justice, about mercy, about righteousness, about love, about grace, about forgiveness, about the law, about the prophets. He's teaching all of these things, right? And in the midst of the teaching, the religious leaders of the day brought to him a woman who had been caught, and just you all probably know this, but if you don't, just understand that the sense of the original language gives you the idea that she was not just caught in adultery, but she was caught in the very act of adultery. So they bring her to Jesus. We know from a background perspective that they're doing so not because they're interested in holiness, but they're doing so because they're interested in control. They're doing so because they want to trick Jesus and put him between a rock and a hard place so that they can prove forevermore that he's not the one that everybody was looking for. So they ask him, "Teacher," verse 4, "this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. What do you say?" If you read a lot of church history, you'll understand that by the time this event happens in the ministry of Jesus, God's people were not actually stoning many people. So you have to keep that in mind, because the Pharisees are like, we're supposed to do this, a thing that they were not committed to doing in the first place. They're not interested in righteousness. They're not interested in justice. They are only interested in removing the threat to their powerful throne, so to speak. They're only interested in getting Jesus off the scene. I think it's worth noting, though, that quite often, some of the people who most misuse terms like justice and mercy and love and righteousness are religious leaders, are religious people. Ladies and gentlemen, we should be cautioned. We should be careful to never let our fervor for God's word and our fervor and our passion for his ways, his church, his word. We should never let that actually get in the way. Not those things, but a passion about it get in the way of his heart. Because he still desires to have his heart flow through his people. So they asked Jesus, "What do you say?" And he says to them in verse 6, they said this to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. And Jesus bent down and he wrote with his finger on the ground. Just so you know, I love that part. I didn't think about this till just now. I love that part. As a follower of Jesus, maybe that's a pretty good way to react to people who just want to pick a fight. Maybe a good way to react is just to say nothing. You know what I mean? And write them a love letter. I don't know. Maybe we could do that. Well, Jesus bends down and he begins to write with his finger on the ground. Now, scholars throughout history, people have been debating for 2,000 years what he wrote. I'm going to tell you what he wrote. No, actually, I'm not, because I have no idea what he wrote. We're not told. You know what I mean? He just bent down and he wrote. I think what we're supposed to pay attention to is not so much that he wrote, although he did, and that would be interesting. But oftentimes, while we're wondering and speculating about what he wrote, right, we miss the reality that he didn't say anything. We miss the challenge to just sometimes, in the midst of confrontation, we need to just be quiet. He said with a hushed whisper. Especially when we're in the midst of a situation that we feel like needs justice. Well, Jesus bends down and he begins to write on the ground. And as they, verse 7, continued to ask him, he stood up and he said to them, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." If you guys are so interested in justice and righteousness, okay. Whoever it is among you that is without sin, and the language seems to indicate maybe even this same sin, you go ahead. Throw the first rock. We know the story, right? We've read it before. How many of you read this story before? Raise your hands. Perfect. Okay. If you're unfamiliar with the story, at this moment, take a minute and imagine the woman. She's dragged in her shame and her embarrassment. She's dragged before a crowd, and this one person that everybody by this time had heard about, who was supposed to be like no other person. Could he even be the Messiah? And if he is, then what would he do or say? She would have been blown away when he didn't say anything and began to write on the ground. I wonder if she would have been able to even read what he was writing. Maybe, maybe not. But can you imagine her fear and her anxiety and her trembling and her overwhelming terror when Jesus seems to give permission for them to do what they were asking to do with a condition? Can you imagine? We read it in just a minute, but can you imagine? That moment would have taken an eternity for her as she's standing there and This crowd of legalists gets the green light to throw a rock at her on one condition. During the midst of those stressful, overwhelming, and anxious moments, they all went away. Verse 9, verse 8, and once more he bent down and he wrote on the ground. But when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones. And Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus stood up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" And she said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Now go, and from now on, sin no more." I will readily admit it's not necessarily a story we would associate with the justice of God. However, since we went ahead and have done that, it's communicating so much about God's justice. It's communicating so much about God's perfect, right, and impartial standard of fairness that flows from his holy character. First and foremost, it reflects that it reveals that God's justice is a reflection of his righteousness. Justice is inherently tied to God's righteousness. Since God is morally perfect, his justice is always fair, right, and true. His justice reflects his righteousness. I don't know about you, but I was thinking about this. Man, it feels like the church is divided these days. And when I say church, I'm not talking about this one. I'm talking about globally. And like many days, it seems to be divided along these lines of like holiness and liberalism. And I'm not talking about political liberalism. I'm talking about theological liberalism. I'm talking about the reality that there are legalists and those who mandate that the law should be kept. And on the other side, those who are more drawn to grace. I tend to be both. I like them both. You see, I like legalism. I like it because it serves me well. Like, I like the ability to point everybody else's sins out because then you can control and manipulate the masses even better, right? I don't know about you, but I like that. But I also like the grace of God and the mercy of God's justice because it allows me to be off the hook. Not you, but me, right? And this is the problem. And if you're looking at this, there are those who maybe are more drawn to legalism that would look at it and say, well, this isn't even fair. What is he thinking? He's letting people off the hook. If you give them an inch, they'll take a mile. We've got to stop this. On the other hand, there are those who like grace and go, ooh, look at that. Everybody sins anyway, so what's it matter? I can walk away and sin no more, right? Both camps, I suggest, misunderstand the justice of God. His justice reflects his righteousness, and what he does in this moment is perfect. What he does in this moment then was unimaginable and mind-blowing still to this day. And the reason it is because it's perfect. It's a reflection of his righteousness. It's a reflection of his perfect ability to judge any and every circumstance that is brought before him. Perfect. I suggest to you he judges it, or he exercises justice in a way that we wouldn't. And I might add that he has the ability to do so because even in this moment, he was aware that he would go and guarantee his justice by giving his life on the cross. Like he would satisfy the justice of God himself, which gave him the ability to forgive, the ability to restore, the ability to change. God's justice upholds moral order. Note that in that passage, he told her, he didn't argue with her, did you really do what they're saying you did? That was a foregone conclusion. They didn't talk about it. And just so we are clear, I don't know what anybody's opinion is about adultery. I don't know what anybody's opinion is about immorality. I don't know what anybody's opinion is about right things and wrong things. On one level, I know for human beings, They're good and interesting topics of conversation, but at the end of the day, they never satisfy the justice of God. They never satisfy the righteousness of God. So on one level, I really don't care what you think, and I really don't care what I think, right? What's important is what God thinks. And his justice in this moment upholds morality or moral order. He doesn't just turn a blind eye to her and go, whatever. Did you mean it? Was it that bad? They did worse. He doesn't play that game. He looks at her and he says, I don't condemn you either based on your willingness to go from here and stop doing that. Does that make sense? Ladies and gentlemen, if we as a church, if we as Christians, as we as believers, if we would embrace the justice of God in the way that he challenged this woman, morality would change. Morality that happens from the inside out. You got to know his interaction with her affected her heart because no one had interacted with her like that before. Everybody else, all the other religious leaders, they were ready to kill her, so to speak. He, on the other hand, is ready to give her life and life everlasting. That changes someone on the inside, don't you know? You ever been forgiven of something by someone that you didn't deserve to be forgiven for? Anyone? There's something that happens within that relationship, isn't there? Something happens, a closeness, a realness that happens. This is what's going on. God's justice upholds moral order. I recognize we live in a time that is politically charged. Yeah? Are you guys aware of this? We live in a time in the United States of America that are politically charged, and we happen to live within the context of a two-party system no matter how much we want independence. I didn't know somebody would amen that. Within the two-party system right now, both parties are talking about what is just and what is right. You may not know that because your Facebook feed is only giving you half the story. There's a lot being said. And a lot of people are trying to convince other people that the only way to get justice in America, to stop the injustices, is to vote this way or that way. I would suggest to you this. That mentality is short-sighted, and the results will be short-lived. Because it's the same argument that's been happening in the United States since 1776. It's the same argument that's been happening among humanity since the dawn of creation and the fall of man into the tragedy of sin. You know what's going to change morality in the United States of America? You know what's going to change? By the way, we shouldn't be so short-sighted and only be interested in the good old US of A, which, by the way, I love. But we also have to recognize there's a whole other world out there. And the things what's going to actually change and affect morality, not only in our world, but the world, is nothing short of the righteousness and the righteous justice of God. It's him. Our hope must be in him. God's justice also defends the vulnerable. I love this, don't you? You read this story and you can't help but to think about those that have been treated horribly. God's justice especially extends to the poor, the oppressed, the widow, and the orphan. His justice includes a special concern for those who are powerless. And in this day, this woman in those circumstances was powerless. And yet Jesus stood up. Justice personified, righteousness in a person. He stands up and he defends the vulnerable. If we're really interested in helping somebody, yes, we need to help them wherever we can, physically and practically, but we should not shortchange helping them spiritually and having them at least finding a way to communicate how important Jesus is and what he can actually do and how much he cares. His justice is both restorative and redemptive. Go and sin no more. Go and stop doing this. It's restorative. She's actually launched back into her world. Go and sin no more. Go and stop it. But the emphasis is on, like, go. There's restoration and redemption for her. From this moment on, the woman would have had one of the most incredible testimonies of women in that day, in that region. They're like, aren't you? And she's like, yes, I am. However, whatever happened with that? Well, let me tell you a story. And she would have told about the moment that Jesus looked her in the eyes, overflowing with love, and said, now you go and sin no more. Could it be that that's the reality of his justice? That's the effect it's supposed to have on us. It's not just supposed to manage our morality. It's supposed to restore and redeem our lives. Does that make sense? It's not supposed to be something that causes us to tiptoe around life, making sure that we don't go where we're not supposed to go. It's supposed to be something that's freeing, that allows us to be restored in our relationship with God and redeemed in the way we live our lives. Free to go ahead and shine for the reality of his love. His justice is restorative and redemptive. It's also balanced by mercy and grace. Did you notice this? Like, this gets lost sometimes. Sometimes we think that it's just a story of mercy and grace. And although it is, it's a story of mercy and grace on top of the foundation of righteousness and justice. He has the moment to actually challenge her, to free her up, to restore and redeem her. He has the ability to do so because he will actually pay the penalty once and for all for that sin, for your sin, for my sin, for all sin. And it is a reflection of his mercy and his grace. And he does it perfectly, like it's a perfect balance of righteousness, justice, holiness, mercy, and grace. Have you ever tried to do that on your own? Have you ever tried to get it right on your own? I would only appeal to parents in the room. You ever tried to perfectly balance justice and mercy and grace with your children? You either create prisoners or spoiled, rotten brats. Does that make sense? Like, it's so hard. There's a beauty in recognizing that God's justice is balanced between perfect righteousness, mercy, and grace. There's nothing ever wrong with what he has done, is doing, and will do. His justice also leads to lasting peace and harmony. Can you imagine the guilt and shame that she showed up with on that day? The guilt and shame that she showed up with on that day was removed with the words, go and stop sinning. With the restoration and the redemption that she experienced in that moment, there came within her, without a doubt, a peace and a harmony. A peace about it's settled. She didn't have to live with this reality of hiding a secret that was not so secret. She didn't have to wonder if somebody would see it and find out. She didn't have to wonder if people would whisper and gossip about it. All that stuff was gone because she had received the perfect peace that comes with the justice of God, that's lasting. There's a peace that passes understanding, right? That is the ability for peace to pass understanding is because it flows from the justice of God. It flows from a place where God has settled all the accounts in his Son. So there's this perfect peace which allows her to once again live in harmony with not only God but with one another. Not a word that we use very often. It's a word, we use words like community, fellowship, relationship. What if we just started using harmony? It says something. What if the justice of God that works in our life, that brings about forgiveness and restoration, what if we understood that that wasn't just for our benefit, but it was also for the benefit of others? That we might walk in harmony with both God and the people around us. Harmony. You guys love it when Emma and other parts of the worship parts, you know, like lungs and, and livers and hearts, pieces and parts. You just love it when the worship team begins to harmonize with one another. When all of a sudden someone's singing, right? And then the other person sings, and you ever been in that moment with worship where, let's say Dalton is up here and he's singing, holy, holy. That's not how he sounds, but it's better. Oh, not me, he's better. Holy, right? And then all of a sudden Emma comes in. Did you guys hear that? Emma comes in, holy, holy. But it sounds way better than that. And the hair on your arms start to stand up because there's a harmony going on there. And you're like, oh, it's so good. I love it when they do that. Could you do it more? Right? But you don't shout that out in church because we're not that kind of a church. Right? Instead, you just keep it quiet. But you really love it. That sound is an example of how we're to be with one another. And it has very little to do with singing songs and everything to do with sharing life in that way. We are supposed to add beauty to the existence of each and every person we come across, because the justice of God has freed us up to live in harmony with both him and his people. Let me make this clear. The relationships that we have with other people are supposed to be beautiful. Lastly, which you might be happy to hear, not lastly because that's all that the Bible has to say about God's justice, but lastly because that's all we have time for today, God's justice brings about a transformation of one's heart. You got to believe that she walked away and something happened and she was different. God's justice is transformative, leading people to reflect his righteousness and mercy. Through his divine justice, hearts and lives are forever changed. Justice doesn't only punish wrongdoing, but it also reforms the individual and the community to live justly. I would say this: the results of God's justice as described in the Bible are profound and transformative, affecting individuals and communities and the entire world. And the cross of Jesus Christ guarantees it for all those who believe. You see, when we embrace and believe in the reality of God's provision of his Son as a substitutionary atonement for our sins, we are embracing his justice and righteousness. We are embracing the reality that justice was accomplished. Our sins have been paid for. Righteousness has been imparted to us. The biblical picture it's given to us like a robe that envelops us, usually with a big hug from the Father. Check out the Gospel of Luke. You'll read about it. We should never forget that Jesus actually guarantees justice, righteousness, grace, and mercy for us, because he accomplished all that God requires for it on the cross. Like, there's nothing left for us to do to earn it, but there's a whole lot that we can do in response of it, in response to it. Number one, I believe this: may we be a people who have believed and are willing to wait on him. If you look throughout human history, the world gets in trouble every single time humanity takes justice into their own hands. Some of the most popular movies, man. My little guy, Ezekiel, don't judge me. I'm about to give you an insight into our lives and our parenting, so don't judge me. If you have problems with what I'm about to say, don't send me an email, don't send me a text, don't mean me, don't do anything. Come and talk to me in person, right? And we'll sit down and we'll cry together. I've been letting him watch Spider-Man. I've been letting him watch Spider-Man, and every once in a while in Spider-Man, they cuss. And people say, oh, that was a bad word. And I'm like, listen, there's a whole lot more things in life that I'm worried about for this 5-year-old than cussing. Cussing we can deal with and we can manage. Now, don't get me wrong. Some of you are going to walk out and say, did you know that Darren lets his son cuss? That is not at all what I said. That is not at all what I said. Others are going to walk out and go, did you know that Pastor Darren, he dials up things on TV to have cuss words so that his son will learn how to cuss? That is not what we're talking about. He loves Spider-Man. You know why he likes Spider-Man? Because he can wing and sling webs, right? He also likes it because within the heart of each one of us is a longful desire for justice. He loves the fact that Spidey can show up and right wrongs. He's 5. Where did that come from? I believe this, the reality of God's implantation and creation of us. It's all in there, and it's coming out at 5. He just loves it, right? He loves that Spidey can just swing out of nowhere and rescue somebody and provide justice. He loves that Spidey can envelop the bad guys in a web and they can't move. He loves it. That's within all of us. And I don't know about you, but there are times in life when I look at the culture around me that I'd like to be like Spider-Man. I'd like to swing into the circumstances and situations where people are being taken advantage of, where people are being lied to, where people are lying. I'd like to swing into all of it and sling webs all over the place and make everything right. But the problem is I can't. I don't have superpowers, and without those superpowers, I can't do it on my own anyway because I ain't smart enough. Does that make sense? It's important for us. I think one of the things that we're supposed to do as people when it comes to the justice of God, we're supposed to take the movies in as entertainment, but then set them aside. They're not supposed to lead our lives. Instead, when it comes to justice, we have to be willing to wait on him. We have to allow God to work. We have to step back. We cannot be like those religious leaders of yesteryear. That's a good word. We can't be like them with rocks in hand, ready to chuck them at anybody who gets out of hand. We just can't do that. We have to be willing to wait on God. We have to be willing to have faith. We have to be willing to trust that he can do what we can't do. Yes? Now, some of you I know are probably, like myself, praying, Lord, but a little web slinging wouldn't be a little power. Right? Which, by the way, there's nothing more adorable and funny than watching a 5-year-old pretend like he's slinging webs. He's like, his fingers don't work. And he's like, he comes running out of the room last night, and he goes running back. And I'm like, what did I do? Right? We can't take matters into our own hands. We have to wait on God. And while we're waiting, because waiting doesn't mean doing nothing. While we're waiting, we might as well worship him, right? We might as well sing songs of praise to him. We might as well pray prayers of faith to him. We might as well live lives that honor him. That's what waiting means, right? That's what worship means. So while we wait for his justice to overcome all the evil everywhere once and for all, one story at a time, one situation at a time, wherever and however he does it, let's worship him. And as we do that, guess what happens? We become a witness to him. We become someone that somebody pays attention to. And they wonder and they question, where does that peace come from? Where does that trust come from? Where does that hope come from? May we be a people who have not only believed, but are also willing to wait on the Lord, to worship the Lord, and witness of the Lord, knowing that he is a just